The fluorescent lights of the cramped studio apartment buzzed overhead as Daniel Crawford stood motionless, staring at the divorce papers his wife Jessica had just slammed onto their secondhand coffee table. But what she didn't know was that the funeral he'd attended 3 days ago wasn't for just any father. It was for a secret real estate mogul who'd built an empire in silence. Jessica's designer heels clicked impatiently against the worn linoleum as she checked her phone again. But her eyes held no sympathy for the man she'd promised to love in sickness and health. Behind her perfectly applied makeup was a woman who'd already made her choice, but that choice involved Richard Sterling, Daniel's boss at Morrison & Associates, the man who'd been undermining Daniel for 2 years. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating, but Daniel had learned to swallow his pride working minimum wage while putting himself through night school. His father's funeral had been sparsely attended, but the lawyer who'd approached him afterward had handed him a manila envelope that would change everything. Inside that envelope was documentation of a $140 billion estate portfolio spanning 17 countries, but Jessica was too busy rehearsing her goodbye speech to notice the way Daniel's hands trembled. She called him useless that morning, but she had no idea what was coming. Richard had called him useless too, but those words would soon taste like ash. What Jessica didn't understand was that the man she was leaving had just become one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. But she was too blinded by her own ambition to see the storm brewing behind his quiet eyes. The question wasn't whether she'd regret her decision, but how spectacularly that regret would unfold. Would Daniel reveal his inheritance and watch her crawl back? But would he have the strength to say no? Could a woman who'd abandoned him at his lowest moment ever truly understand what she'd thrown away? But more importantly, would the man she was running to accept her when the truth emerged? The answer would shock everyone, but especially Jessica, who thought she knew exactly what her future held. Daniel Crawford had never imagined his life would unravel on a Tuesday, but Tuesdays had a way of being cruel in their mundane efficiency, and this particular Tuesday had started with burnt toast and ended with his wife's ultimatum. The morning had been typical enough. Daniel had woken at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of his neighbor's dog barking through paper-thin walls, but he'd learned to tune out the noise over the 3 years they'd lived in this glorified closet on the wrong side of downtown. Jessica had still been asleep, but her phone had been buzzing on the nightstand with messages she'd quickly silence whenever he was around. He should have known then, but hindsight had a way of sharpening details that seemed insignificant in the moment. The funeral had been 5 days ago, but Daniel could still smell the rain-soaked earth of Greenwood Cemetery. His father, Thomas Crawford, had been buried in a plot so modest it seemed almost apologetic, but the 7 people who'd attended, including Daniel and the mysterious lawyer, had stood in silence as the casket was lowered. Daniel had barely known his father, but that was by design. Thomas had left when Daniel was 6, sending irregular child support payments and birthday cards with generic messages, but never explaining where the money came from or why he'd chosen absence over presence. But the lawyer, Arthur Pembroke of Pembroke & Associates, had changed everything. "Mr. Crawford," Arthur had said, approaching Daniel as the other attendees dispersed like smoke. His suit was impeccable but understated, but his eyes held the weight of secrets. "I represent your father's estate, but I think we should speak privately. Tomorrow, if possible. My office at 2 p.m.? Daniel had agreed, but he'd assumed it was about funeral expenses or perhaps a small life insurance policy. His father had worked in property management, but that could mean anything from supervising apartment buildings to being a glorified maintenance man. Daniel had inherited his father's height and his tendency toward silence, but he'd always assumed he'd avoided inheriting his father's failure. But he'd been wrong about everything. Arthur's office had been located in the Sinclair Tower, but not in the affordable lower floors, in the penthouse suite where lawyers who handled billions, not thousands, kept their practices. The receptionist had known Daniel's name before he'd introduced himself, but her smile had been professional and unrevealing. Arthur had greeted him in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but Daniel had felt like an imposter in his off-the-rack suit and scuffed shoes. "Your father was a very private man," Arthur had begun, sliding a leather portfolio across the mahogany table. But his tone suggested this was an understatement of cosmic proportions. He built his wealth over 40 years, but he did so quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary success. He owned real estate across 17 countries, but he operated through shell companies in trust to maintain his anonymity. Daniel had opened the portfolio with shaking hands, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. Property holdings in Manhattan, London, Tokyo, Dubai, Singapore, Sydney, Paris, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, Miami, Toronto, Vancouver, Berlin, São Paulo, Mumbai, Shanghai, and Monaco. But these weren't modest investments. These were landmark buildings, luxury developments, commercial complexes, and historic properties. The estimated total value calculated by 3 independent firms was $140 billion, but the number seemed too large to be real. "This is impossible," Daniel had whispered, but Arthur had shaken his head. "Your father was a genius at identifying undervalued properties in emerging markets," Arthur had explained, pulling up digital files on his tablet. "He bought his first building in 1984 for $200,000 in what was then a deteriorating neighborhood in Manhattan. But he saw what others didn't, that the city was on the verge of a renaissance. He flipped that property for $2 million 3 years later, but instead of celebrating, he reinvested everything. By 1995, he owned 40 properties across 6 countries, but he lived modestly, avoided publicity, and let his portfolio grow exponentially." But Daniel's mind had been reeling. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he be in your life?" Arthur had finished gently. "He struggled with that decision every day, but he believed that wealth corrupted, that it made people targets, and that you deserved a chance to build your own character without his shadow. He was wrong, of course, but his intentions were complicated." The portfolio had included a letter from Thomas, but Daniel hadn't been able to read it in the office. Instead, he'd folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. But he'd known Jessica would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. He'd left Arthur's office with a new phone number, a new bank account with immediate access to $50 million in liquid assets, with more to come as the estate was fully transferred, and a completely new understanding of who his father had been. But he'd also left with a warning. "Don't tell anyone immediately. These things have a way of bringing out the worst in people, but you'll know when the time is right." Daniel had heeded that warning, but perhaps he'd waited too long. By the time he'd gotten home that evening 3 days ago, Jessica had been on the phone in the bedroom with the door closed, but her laughter had sounded too intimate, too comfortable. He'd started noticing things then. The way she angled her phone away from him, the new perfume, the sudden interest in going to Morrison and Associates after-work events, but most tellingly, the way she'd started picking fights over money. "We can't keep living like this," she'd said that night, but her tone had been accusatory rather than concerned. "Daniel, you're 34 years old, but you're still working as a mid-level analyst at a company that doesn't respect you. Richard says—" She'd stopped abruptly, but the damage was done. "Richard says what?" Daniel had asked quietly, but he'd already known. Jessica had recovered quickly, but her cheeks had flushed. "Richard says that Morrison is planning layoffs, but people with initiative will be safe. You need to be more aggressive, but you just accept whatever scraps they throw you." But Daniel had been distracted by his father's letter, which he'd finally read in the bathroom while Jessica watched her reality shows. Thomas's handwriting had been shaky but legible, but the words had cut deep. "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, but I hope I'm leaving you something valuable. Not just money, but a choice. I chose absence because I was afraid, but I see now that fear made me a coward. I watched you from a distance, every school play, every graduation, every small triumph, but I never had the courage to be present. The money is yours, but I hope you'll use it to build something better than I did. Don't let it isolate you, but don't let others use you either. Trust slowly, but love completely. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved, but I'm proud of the man you became despite me. Dad." Daniel had cried silently in that bathroom, but he'd also felt something shift inside him. His father had been watching, but from a distance that made the gesture almost meaningless. The money was overwhelming, but it didn't erase 34 years of questions. Still, it was something, but what that something meant, he was still figuring out. But then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Daniel had arrived at Morrison & Associates at 8 a.m., as usual, but Richard Sterling had been waiting at his desk with a smirk that made Daniel's stomach clench. Richard was everything Daniel wasn't. Tall, charismatic, expensive suit, but most importantly, ruthless. He'd been passed over for promotion twice in favor of Richard, but he'd told himself that merit would eventually prevail. But merit had nothing to do with anything. "Crawford," Richard had said, perching on the edge of Daniel's desk like he owned it, but his tone was casual poison. "We need to talk about the Henderson account. You dropped the ball, but I managed to salvage it. Henderson specifically asked for me to take over, but don't worry, I'll make sure everyone knows you tried your best." It was a lie, but a beautifully constructed one. Daniel had spent 3 months cultivating the Henderson relationship, but Richard had swooped in during the final presentation and taken credit. The worst part was that their boss, Patricia Morrison, had believed Richard's version of events, but she'd always had a blind spot where Richard was concerned. "That's not what happened," Daniel had said quietly, but even to his own ears, he'd sounded defeated. Richard had laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's exactly what happened, but if you want to make a formal complaint, go ahead. I'm sure Patricia would love to hear how you're not a team player." He'd stood then, adjusting his cufflinks, but his final words had been delivered with surgical precision. "Face it, Crawford, you're useless here. You don't have the hunger, but more importantly, you don't have what it takes to succeed. Some people are just meant to be background noise." But Daniel had said nothing, because what was there to say? That evening, Jessica had been waiting for him with the divorce papers, but she'd been dressed like she was going somewhere important. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect, but her eyes were cold. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said without preamble, but she'd rehearsed this speech. "Daniel, I married you because I thought you had potential, but 5 years later, we're still living in this dump while my friends are buying houses and taking vacations. You're a good person, but good doesn't pay the bills. I need more, but you can't give me that." Daniel had felt something crack inside him, but he'd kept his voice steady. "Jessica, my father just died. Can we talk about this?" "Your father abandoned you," she'd interrupted, but her words were scalpel sharp. "He was a deadbeat who sent birthday cards, but he never gave you anything real. I'm sorry he died, but that doesn't change our situation. I've filed for divorce, but I'm willing to make this easy. You can have the furniture, but I want out of the lease. I've already found a new place." The implications had hung in the air like smoke, but Daniel had to ask, "With Richard?" Jessica's silence had been confirmation enough, but then she doubled down. "Richard is successful, but more than that, he's ambitious. He sees opportunities, but he seizes them. You just exist. I need someone who's going to build a life, but you're content with mediocrity. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I'm done settling." She'd called him useless without using the word, but the meaning was clear. And then she'd left, promising to return for her things over the weekend. But Daniel had barely heard her. He'd sat in that empty apartment for hours, but he hadn't cried. Instead, he'd felt a cold clarity settling over him like frost. But morning had brought a text from Richard. "Heard the news. Sorry it didn't work out, but Jessica deserves someone who can provide for her. No hard feelings, right?" No hard feelings, but the audacity was breathtaking. Daniel had gone to work that Wednesday, but he'd moved through the day like a ghost. Colleagues had whispered, but he'd ignored them. Patricia had called him into her office to discuss transitioning the Henderson account permanently to Richard, but she'd couched it as an opportunity for Daniel to focus on smaller clients where he'd be more comfortable. It was a demotion in everything but name, but Daniel had simply nodded. "You're taking this well," Patricia had said, but she'd sounded suspicious. "I expected more pushback." "I'm reevaluating my priorities," Daniel had replied, but he'd left it at that. That evening, he'd called Arthur Pembroke, but his hands had been steady. "I want to move forward with the estate transfer, but I also want to make some immediate arrangements. Can we accelerate the timeline?" Arthur had been surprised but professional, but he'd agreed to meet the next morning. "I should warn you, Daniel, once people know about the money, everything changes. But I suspect you already understand that. I do, Daniel had said. But he'd been thinking about Jessica's cold eyes and Richard's smirk. But I think it's time for some changes. The next 6 weeks had been a masterclass in preparation, but Daniel had been patient. Arthur had helped him establish a private investment firm, Crawford Global Holdings, but they'd done so quietly, through layers of legal entities that kept Daniel's name out of public records. He'd begun acquiring assets, first a portfolio of luxury apartments in the city, but then something more strategic. He'd learned that Morrison and Associates was struggling financially, but Patricia had been shopping for investors to avoid bankruptcy. The Henderson account had been their last hope, but even that wouldn't be enough. But Daniel had seen an opportunity. Through Crawford Global Holdings, he'd made an anonymous offer to acquire Morrison and Associates, but at a significant discount. Patricia had been desperate enough to accept, but the deal had included one condition. All current management would remain in place during a 3-month evaluation period, after which the new owner would make staffing decisions. It was standard corporate acquisition language, but it gave Daniel time to watch and wait. Meanwhile, Jessica had moved in with Richard, but their relationship had become Instagram official within 2 weeks. Photos of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and Richard's new car had flooded social media, but Daniel had watched from a distance with cold detachment. Jessica looked happy, but there was something performative about it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as her followers. Richard had been promoted to senior vice president at Morrison and Associates, but he'd been insufferable about it. He'd started treating Daniel with open contempt, assigning him menial tasks and making jokes about dead weight during team meetings, but Daniel had absorbed it all without reaction. His colleagues had started to pity him, but that was fine. Pity was useful, but Daniel had also been busy. He'd quietly purchased the building that housed Morrison and Associates offices, but he'd done so through a subsidiary that gave no indication of his involvement. He'd acquired several properties Jessica had once pointed out during their marriage. A penthouse she'd said was perfect, and a vacation home in the Hamptons she'd called the dream, but he'd done nothing with them yet. He'd also made anonymous donations to causes Jessica claimed to care about, but under Richard's name, creating a paper trail that would later prove interesting. 3 months after the funeral, Daniel had finally been ready, but the catalyst had been unexpected. Morrison and Associates had thrown a celebration for Richard's promotion, but it had been held at an upscale restaurant Daniel couldn't have afforded 6 months ago. He'd been invited out of obligation, but everyone had expected him to decline. Instead, he'd arrived in a simple but well-tailored suit, but he'd stayed in the background, nursing a single drink and watching. Jessica had been there as Richard's date, but she'd avoided eye contact with Daniel. She'd looked expensive, new dress, new jewelry, new confidence, but there was a brittleness to her smile. Richard had been holding court, telling a story about closing a major deal, but he'd been exaggerating his role. Daniel had known because he'd actually done the preliminary work Richard was claiming credit for. Poor Daniel, someone had whispered nearby, but they'd thought he couldn't hear. He just doesn't have what it takes, but at least he's handling the divorce well. I heard Jessica upgraded significantly, another voice had added, but this one had been openly catty. Richard Sterling is going places, but Daniel was always going to be stuck. Daniel had felt nothing, but that emptiness had been instructive. He'd spent so many years trying to prove himself to people whose opinions ultimately meant nothing, but now he saw them clearly. They were sharks circling what they perceived as weakness, but they had no idea what was actually in the water with them. But then Patricia Morrison had clinked her glass for attention, and the room had fallen silent. I want to take a moment to thank everyone for their hard work during a challenging time she'd begun, but her smile had been strained. As many of you know, Morrison and Associates has undergone some changes recently, but I'm pleased to announce that we've secured new ownership that will help us grow and thrive. Our new owner has requested anonymity during this transition, but I've been assured that our core team will remain intact. Here's to new beginnings, Richard had called out, raising his glass, but his confidence had been absolute. He'd assumed his position was secure, but he'd made that assumption based on Patricia's favoritism, not merit. But Patricia had continued, and her next words had shifted the energy in the room. However, our new owner has requested an immediate meeting with all senior staff tomorrow morning, but also specifically requested that Daniel Crawford attend. I'm not sure why, but those were the terms of the acquisition. The room had gone quiet, but curious glances had been directed at Daniel. Richard had frowned, but Jessica had looked confused. Daniel had simply nodded, but he'd offered no explanation. Probably wants to fire him personally, Richard had muttered to Jessica, but his voice had carried. New owners always clean house, but they start with the weakest links. Jessica had laughed, but it had sounded forced. Daniel had left the party early, but not before catching Jessica watching him leave. For just a moment, her mask had slipped, but he'd seen something there. Not quite regret, but perhaps a flicker of uncertainty. He'd filed that away, but he'd said nothing. The next morning, Daniel had arrived at Morrison & Associates at 8 a.m., but he'd entered through the building's main lobby rather than the office entrance. The building manager, Marcus Thompson, had recognized him immediately, but that was because Daniel had met with him personally 3 weeks ago as the building's new owner. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford," Marcus had said with a respectful nod, but he'd kept his voice low. "Everything is prepared as you requested. Conference room A, but the management team should be gathering shortly." "Thank you, Marcus," Daniel had replied, but he'd headed to his office first to collect a few personal items. The space looked exactly as he'd left it, cluttered, modest, forgettable, but he wouldn't be returning to it. He'd boxed up the few photos and books that mattered, but he'd left everything else. Someone else could deal with it. By 9 a.m., the conference room had been full, but the atmosphere had been tense. Patricia had been there, along with Richard and 4 other senior managers, but they'd all been waiting for the mysterious new owner. Daniel had slipped in last, taking a seat in the back, but Richard had noticed and smirked. "Glad you could join us, Crawford," Richard had said, but his tone had been mocking. "Though I'm not sure why you're here, but I suppose even the coffee boy gets to witness corporate history." A few people had laughed nervously, but most had looked uncomfortable. Patricia had shot Richard a warning glance, but she'd said nothing. She'd been too worried about making a good impression on the new owner. But then Arthur Pembroke had entered, carrying a leather briefcase, and the mood had shifted. Arthur was recognizable. His firm handled only the wealthiest clients, but his presence suggested the new owner was someone significant. He'd nodded politely to the room, but his eyes had found Daniel's, and he'd given the slightest smile. "Good morning," Arthur had begun, moving to the head of the conference table. "Thank you all for being here, but I'll keep this brief. 3 months ago, Crawford Global Holdings acquired Morrison & Associates, but as stipulated in the acquisition agreement, this morning marks the end of the evaluation period. The owner has reviewed all personnel files, performance records, and financial contributions, but he's ready to make some decisions." "When do we meet him?" Patricia had asked, but her voice had been eager. "We're ready to discuss our vision for the company's future." Arthur had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "You're about to meet him now, but I think you'll be surprised." He gestured toward Daniel, who'd stood slowly, but the room had erupted in confusion. "What is this?" Richard had demanded, but his face had gone pale. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Daniel had said quietly, moving to stand beside Arthur. "Crawford Global Holdings is my company, but I've been operating quietly since inheriting my father's estate. Arthur has been helping me transition into my new role, but I wanted to see how Morrison & Associates operated before making any changes. I've learned a lot over the past 3 months." The silence had been deafening, but Jessica had appeared in the doorway then, looking confused. She'd come to bring Richard his forgotten phone, but she'd frozen when she'd seen Daniel at the head of the table. "I don't understand," Patricia had whispered, but her face had gone ashen. "Your father was a secret real estate mogul who built a $140 billion estate portfolio," Daniel had finished, but his voice had remained calm. "He died 3 months ago, but he left everything to me. I've spent the time since then learning about his businesses and deciding what to do with them. Acquiring Morrison & Associates was strategic, but also personal." Richard had stood abruptly, but his chair had clattered backward. "This is insane, but you can't just—" "I can, actually," Daniel had interrupted. But there had been steel in his voice now. "As the majority owner, I have complete authority over all staffing and operational decisions, but I've taken my time making them. Arthur, if you would? Arthur had pulled out a folder, but he distributed copies to each person in the room. Inside, you'll find your new employment status, but I'll summarize. Patricia Morrison, you're being retained as a senior consultant with a significant pay cut and reduced responsibilities. But your institutional knowledge is valuable during this transition. You enabled a toxic work environment, but you also built this company from nothing, so you'll have a chance to prove you can do better. Patricia had nodded mutely, but tears had been forming in her eyes. As for the rest of you, Arthur had continued, but his gaze had swept the room. Your positions are being evaluated individually based on merit, performance, and ethical conduct. Most of you will be retained, but some changes are necessary. But everyone had been looking at Richard, who'd remained standing, but his confidence had evaporated. And me? He'd demanded, but his voice had cracked. Daniel had met his eyes, but there had been no satisfaction in what came next, only cold justice. Richard Sterling, you're being terminated for cause, effective immediately, but the grounds are extensive. You've systematically taken credit for other people's work, created a hostile work environment, manipulated performance reviews, and engaged in conduct unbecoming of your position. I have documentation of 17 separate incidents over the past 2 years alone, but I've also discovered you've been funneling clients to a side business you operate without company disclosure. That's breach of contract, but it's also potentially criminal. Richard had tried to speak, but nothing had come out. You called me useless, Daniel had continued, but his voice had remained level. You undermined me at every opportunity, but you did the same to others. You created a culture where success meant stepping on people. But that ends today. You have 1 hour to clear out your office, but security will escort you from the building. You'll receive 2 weeks severance as required by law, but I'd recommend you not seek references from anyone here. But then Jessica had spoken from the doorway, her voice small. Daniel, I don't understand, but you had money this whole time? Daniel had turned to her slowly, but something in his expression had made her step back. No, Jessica, I had money for 3 months, but I was processing grief and trying to understand what my father left me. I would have told you eventually, but you filed for divorce before I had the chance. You left because you thought I was useless, but you chose someone you believed was successful. You made your decision based on appearances, but now you have to live with it. But we can fix this, Jessica had said, moving into the room now, but her desperation had been palpable. Daniel, we were together for 8 years, but I made a mistake. I was scared about our future, but I never stopped loving you. We can work this out. No, Daniel had said simply, but the word had carried finality. You told me I was mediocre, but you said I existed without purpose. You looked at me with contempt, but you left for someone who treated me worse than you did. You didn't leave because we had problems, but you left because you saw an opportunity you thought was better. I'm not interested in being your backup plan. Richard lied to me, Jessica had insisted, but tears had been streaming down her face now. He said you were about to be fired, but he said he could give me a better life. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Daniel had corrected gently but firmly. Jessica, I don't hate you, but I don't trust you either. You revealed who you are when you thought I had nothing to offer, but that's information I needed. I wish you well, but we're done. Jessica had looked at Richard then, but he'd been staring at Daniel with naked fury. You planned this, Richard had hissed, but his hands had been shaking. You let me humiliate you for months, but you were just waiting to strike. What kind of person does that? The kind who learned patience from watching his father build an empire in silence, Daniel had replied, but his expression had remained neutral. You taught me something valuable, Richard, that people reveal their true character when they think there are no consequences. You were cruel because you could be, but you never considered that the balance of power might shift. That was your mistake. Arthur had cleared his throat, but his message had been clear. Time to wrap up. Richard, Jessica, I'll have to ask you both to leave now, but security will escort you. The rest of you, please review your packets and return to your offices, but we'll have individual meetings throughout the day. As people had filed out, Daniel had remained at the head of the table, but he'd felt oddly empty. There had been no triumph, but there had also been no regret. Jessica had tried to approach him again, but security had intercepted her, and she'd left sobbing. Richard had stormed out without another word, but his career in the industry was likely over. Daniel had made sure other firms would hear about the documentation he'd compiled. Patricia had lingered, but her eyes had been red. "I failed you, Daniel, but I see that now. I let Richard poison this place because he brought in revenue, but I ignored what it cost everyone else. I'm sorry." "I know," Daniel had said quietly, but he'd meant it. "That's why you're staying, but in a reduced capacity. You have a chance to help rebuild this company into something better, but you have to want to do it." She'd nodded, but then she'd asked the question everyone was wondering. "What are you going to do with all this? But more importantly, who are you now?" Daniel had considered that, but he'd thought about his father's letter. "I'm still figuring that out, but I know I don't want to become like Richard or like the people who only value others for what they can provide. My father spent 40 years building wealth in isolation, but he missed out on life. I don't want to make that mistake, but I also won't let people use me." "That's a hard balance," Patricia had observed, but she'd smiled slightly. "But if anyone can find it, I think you can." Over the following weeks, Daniel had restructured Morrison and Associates from the ground up, but he'd done so with unexpected compassion. Employees who'd been overlooked were promoted, but toxic performers were let go. He'd increased base salaries while implementing performance-based bonuses tied to team success rather than individual achievement. But the culture had begun to shift. The Henderson account had actually been saved, not by Richard's machinations, but by a junior analyst named Sarah Chen, who'd done brilliant work that Richard had claimed. Daniel had put her in charge of the account directly, but he'd also given her a significant raise. "Why are you doing this?" she'd asked during their meeting, but her confusion had been genuine. "You don't know me, but you're completely changing my career." "Because talent should be rewarded, not stolen," Daniel had replied, but he'd smiled. "My father taught me that sometimes the best investments are in people, but you have to look beyond the surface." But the most difficult conversation had come 2 months later, when Jessica had requested to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. Daniel had almost declined, but curiosity had won out. She looked different, tired, but also more real somehow, with minimal makeup and her hair pulled back simply. "Thank you for meeting me," she'd started, but her hands had been wrapped around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to say some things." Daniel had waited, but he'd said nothing. "I've spent 2 months thinking about what I did, but also about who I became," Jessica had continued, but her voice had been steady. "I convinced myself that I deserved more, but I never stopped to appreciate what I had. You were kind, faithful, and steady, but I saw those things as weaknesses. Richard showed me what I was chasing. He's shallow, manipulative, and cruel, but I was so blinded by what I thought I wanted that I didn't see it until it was too late." "What happened?" Daniel had asked, but he'd kept his tone neutral. "He dumped me 3 days after the meeting," Jessica had admitted, but she'd laughed bitterly. "Turns out he only wanted me because I was your wife, but once you were successful and I was just his broke girlfriend, I wasn't interesting anymore. He called me, of all things, useless, but he said I should have known he wasn't serious. I guess I should have, but I wanted to believe the fantasy." "I'm sorry," Daniel had said, but he'd surprised himself by meaning it. "Don't be," Jessica had replied, but she'd finally met his eyes. "I needed this wake-up call, but it came at a cost I can never repay. Daniel, I'm not asking you to take me back, but I need you to know that I see now what I threw away. You were building a life based on real things, character, integrity, persistence, but I was chasing illusions. The money you inherited doesn't change who you are, but it revealed who I am, and I don't like what I see." "So what now?" Daniel had asked, but he'd been genuinely curious. "Now I rebuild," Jessica had said, but there had been determination in her voice. "I got a job at a nonprofit, but it pays terribly and the work is hard. I moved into a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, but I'm learning to live within my means. I'm in therapy, but I'm trying to understand why I made the choices I did. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that you deserve better, and I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner. They talked for another hour, but it had been different from their marriage. Honest, direct, without pretense. When they'd parted, Daniel had felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed, but he'd also felt sadness for what might have been if Jessica had trusted him just a little longer. But life had moved forward, and Daniel had found his footing in ways that surprised him. He'd used his inheritance to fund affordable housing projects in underserved communities, but he'd done so quietly, without seeking recognition. He'd established scholarships for children of single parents, but he'd named them after his father, giving Thomas Crawford a legacy beyond wealth. He'd even tracked down the other attendees of his father's funeral, former employees his father had quietly helped over the years, and he'd made sure they were taken care of. Your father would be proud, Arthur had told him during one of their regular meetings, but he'd smiled genuinely. He built wealth, but you're building something more meaningful. I'm trying, Daniel had admitted, but he'd thought about his father's letter. I don't want the money to isolate me, but I also know it changes things. People look at me differently now, but I'm not sure they see me more clearly. Some will, some won't, Arthur had said pragmatically, but his wisdom had been earned over decades. The key is choosing carefully who you let close, but not closing yourself off entirely. Your father made that mistake, but you don't have to repeat it. 6 months after the meeting at Morrison & Associates, Daniel had finally sold the company to a competitor for a significant profit, but he'd ensured all employees received generous severance and retention bonuses. He'd kept his real estate portfolio, but he'd hired a team to manage the day-to-day operations while he'd focused on strategic investments and philanthropy. He'd moved out of the studio apartment into a modest but comfortable townhouse. Nothing ostentatious, but a space that felt like home. And one day, while reviewing property reports in his new home office, he'd received an unexpected email from Richard Sterling. The subject line had read simply, "Acknowledgement," but Daniel had hesitated before opening it. Inside had been a short message. Crawford, I won't insult you by pretending we're friends or that I deserve your forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that losing everything taught me something I should have learned years ago. Success built on undermining others isn't success at all. It's just delayed failure. I'm working in insurance sales now in another state, but I'm starting over with a clean slate. I don't blame you for what happened, but I blame myself for earning it. I hope you're building something good with what you inherited, but more importantly, I hope you're happier than I ever was. Richard. Daniel had read it twice, but he'd ultimately decided not to respond. Some chapters closed without need for additional words, but he'd appreciated the gesture nonetheless. It had shown growth, but it had also shown that consequences sometimes led people to reevaluate their choices. That was its own form of justice. But the real surprise had come on the 1-year anniversary of his father's death, when Daniel had visited the modest grave in Greenwood Cemetery. He'd brought flowers and a letter of his own, but he'd also brought something else, a framed photo of himself standing in front of one of the affordable housing complexes he'd funded. In the photo, he'd been surrounded by families moving into their new homes, but his smile had been genuine. I hope this is what you meant about building something better, Daniel had said quietly to the gravestone. But he'd felt a sense of peace. I'm using your gift to help people, but I'm also trying not to let it define me. I'm still learning, but I think I'm becoming someone both of us can be proud of. The wind had rustled through the cemetery trees, but it had felt almost like an answer. As Daniel had walked back to his car, he'd thought about everything that had changed in 1 year. The shock of inheritance, the betrayal of divorce, the cold satisfaction of watching karma work, but most importantly, the gradual understanding that wealth was just a tool. What mattered was how you used it, but also who you chose to be when the world was watching versus when no one was looking. Jessica had been right about one thing. He'd existed in his old life, but he'd been building something beneath the surface. His father had done the same, but Thomas had done it in isolation. Daniel was determined to do it differently, to use his resources to create opportunities for others, but to also remain connected to the humanity his father had sacrificed. Morrison & Associates had been renamed Crawford Development Group under new ownership, But Daniel had stayed on as a silent partner, helping guide strategy while empowering others to lead. The company had become known for ethical business practices and employee development, but it had also become profitable in ways that benefited everyone involved. And sometimes, late at night, Daniel would take out his father's letter and read it again. But he'd also started writing responses, letters his father would never read, but that helped Daniel process his journey. In one letter he'd written, "Dad, I understand now why you kept your distance, but I still wish you trusted me with the truth. I would have loved you regardless of the money, but I'll never know if you'd have believed that. I'm trying to honor your legacy while building my own, but it's harder than you probably imagine. People see the wealth, but they don't see the person, and sometimes I'm not sure I see him either. But I'm trying, and I think that's what you wanted most, for me to keep trying to be better. Thank you for the gift, but thank you more for teaching me through your absence what presence really means. I won't make your mistakes, but I'll always be grateful for your sacrifice." Daniel. 2 years after his father's death, Daniel had established the Thomas Crawford Foundation, but its mission had been specific: to provide resources, education, and opportunities for children of absent parents. It had been his way of transforming pain into purpose, but it had also been his way of ensuring his father's absence created something meaningful. The Foundation's first major project had been a mentorship program pairing successful professionals with young people who lacked parental guidance. But Daniel had insisted on participating personally. One afternoon a week, he'd meet with a 16-year-old named Marcus, different Marcus, whose father had left when he was 5, but whose potential was enormous. They'd talk about school, goals, fears, but also about how to build a life based on values rather than circumstances. "Do you ever get angry at your dad?" Marcus had asked during one session, but his directness had been refreshing. "Sometimes," Daniel had admitted, but he'd considered the question carefully. "But mostly I just feel sad about what we both missed. But I also understand he did what he thought was best. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. People are complicated, but we get to choose whether their mistakes define us or teach us." "That's deep," Marcus had said, but he'd smiled. "You sound like you've thought about this a lot." "Every day," Daniel had replied honestly, but he'd returned the smile. "But that's okay, because the thinking helps me be better, and maybe someday you'll pay it forward to someone else who needs it." But perhaps the most unexpected development had come when Daniel had been invited to speak at a business conference about ethical wealth management. He'd initially declined, but Arthur had encouraged him to share his story, suggesting it might help others navigate similar situations. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, Daniel had felt a moment of vertigo, but then he'd thought about his father's letter and found his voice. 18 months ago, I inherited $140 billion, but I almost lost everything that mattered before I even knew the money existed," he'd begun. But the room had gone silent. "My wife divorced me to marry my boss because they both believed I was useless, but they measured my worth by my job title and bank account. When the truth came out, they wanted back in, but by then I'd learned something invaluable. The people who value you only when you're successful never really valued you at all." He'd paused, but the audience had been rapt. "I'm not here to celebrate revenge or to pretend money solved my problems," Daniel had continued, but his message had been building. "I'm here to tell you that wealth is just amplification. It makes you more of what you already are. If you're generous, you'll be able to be more generous. But if you're cruel, you'll be able to be more cruel. The money my father left me came with a choice. I could become isolated like he was, or I could use it to build connections and create opportunities. I'm still learning, but I know that the measure of wealth isn't what you have. It's what you do with it and who you become in the process." The speech had been featured in several business publications, but more importantly, it had started conversations. People had reached out to share their own stories of betrayal, inheritance, and transformation. But Daniel had tried to respond to as many as possible. He'd learned that his experience, while unique in scale, was universal in emotion. Everyone had faced rejection, disappointment, and the challenge of choosing who to become when circumstances change. But he'd also learned that shock, while initially satisfying, wasn't a sustainable foundation for happiness. Jessica's and Richard's reactions had been gratifying in the moment, but the real victory had been in building a life based on purpose rather than proving a point. His father had been a secret mogul, but Daniel was determined to be an open one, transparent in his dealings, generous with his resources, but also protective of his own growth and healing. 3 years after his father's death, Daniel had finally started dating again, but slowly and carefully. He'd met Emma Reynolds at a foundation event. She'd been a volunteer coordinator who'd approached him with a funding proposal for a literacy program, but her pitch had been interrupted by her accidentally spilling coffee on his suit. Instead of being mortified, she'd laughed and handed him napkins while declaring, "Well, that's one way to make an impression. You'll never forget me now." She'd been right, but not because of the coffee. Emma had treated him like a person rather than a checkbook, but she'd also challenged him when he'd retreated into work to avoid dealing with emotions. Their first date had been to a neighborhood pizza place, Emma's choice, but they'd talked for 4 hours about everything except money. When he'd finally told her about his inheritance, she'd simply shrugged and said, "That's interesting, but tell me more about the mentorship program. That seems like the real story." But Emma had her own complications. She was still processing a divorce from a partner who'd been emotionally absent, but she'd done the work to understand her own patterns. They'd taken things slowly, building trust through consistency, but Daniel had appreciated that she'd never asked him to prove his wealth. She'd met him in his modest townhouse, but she'd never suggested he buy something bigger. She'd driven her used sedan to events, but she'd never hinted at wanting an upgrade. "Why does the money not matter to you?" Daniel had asked one evening, but they'd been sitting on his back porch watching the sunset. "Because I've seen what chasing money does to people," Emma had replied thoughtfully, but her honesty had been characteristic. "My ex spent our entire marriage trying to impress people who didn't matter, but he forgot to invest in the person who did. I'd rather have someone who's present and kind than someone who's rich and absent. You could be broke, Daniel, but you'd still be someone worth knowing." Those words had meant more than any elaborate gesture, but Daniel had filed them away as proof that real connection was possible even after betrayal. But life had continued to offer surprises, both pleasant and challenging. Morrison and Associates, now Crawford Development Group, had thrived under new leadership, but Daniel had remained involved enough to see his vision implemented. The company had become known for employee development and ethical practices, but it had also become highly profitable, proving that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive. Jessica had eventually reached out again, but not to rekindle romance. Instead, she'd wanted to introduce him to her new partner, Marcus, yes, another Marcus, who'd been a social worker she'd met through her nonprofit work. They'd met for coffee, but the dynamic had been surprisingly comfortable. "I wanted you to meet him," Jessica had explained, but her sincerity had been evident. "Because I wanted you to see that I learned something from losing you. Marcus isn't wealthy, but he's dedicated to helping people. He sees me, but not for what I can provide or how I look. I should have valued those things with you, but I was too immature to recognize them." "I'm happy for you," Daniel had said, but he'd meant it. Marcus had been genuine, asking thoughtful questions about Daniel's foundation work and sharing stories about his own clients. They'd parted as something almost like friends, but with clear boundaries and mutual respect for the past they'd shared. Richard had never resurfaced, but Daniel had heard through industry contacts that he'd eventually found success in a completely different field. He'd become a business consultant specializing in ethical leadership and corporate culture reform. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but apparently Richard had committed genuinely to changing his approach. Daniel had felt no need to reach out, but he'd acknowledged that people could evolve if they chose to do the work. 5 years after his father's death, Daniel had stood at that same modest grave, but this time with Emma beside him. They'd brought flowers together, but they'd also brought photos of the foundation's latest projects, a new community center, a scholarship program, and affordable housing that had won architectural awards for innovative design. "Your son did good, Mr. Crawford," Emma had said softly to the gravestone, but her hand had been in Daniel's. "He took what you built and made it something that helps people. I think you'd be proud." Daniel had squeezed her hand, but he'd felt a sense of completion he'd been chasing for years. His father's absence had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. The wealth had been transformative, but not because of what it bought, because of what it had forced him to learn about himself and others. "What are you thinking?" Emma had asked as they'd walked back to the car, but she'd known him well enough to sense his mood. "I'm thinking about how much can change in 5 years," Daniel had replied, but he'd smiled. "5 years ago, I was sitting in a studio apartment being served divorce papers by someone who called me useless. Today I'm here with you, but I'm also running a foundation, mentoring young people, and building something my father only dreamed about. It's not the money that changed things, but what I chose to do with the opportunity." "And what about Richard and Jessica?" Emma had asked, but her tone had been curious rather than jealous. "Do you ever think about them?" "Sometimes," Daniel had admitted, but he'd been thoughtful. "But not with anger or satisfaction anymore. They taught me important lessons. But the main one was that being called useless by people who don't know your worth is actually a gift. It shows you who not to trust. Jessica wanted me to be someone I wasn't, but Richard wanted me to not exist at all. Neither of them could see past the surface, but that was their limitation, not mine." Emma had nodded, but then she'd asked the question that would define the next chapter. "So who are you now, Daniel Crawford? Not the inheritor, not the philanthropist, but who are you when no one's watching and nothing's at stake?" Daniel had stopped walking, but he'd considered the question carefully. "I'm someone who's still learning, but I'm also someone who's trying to be present in ways my father couldn't be. I'm building connections instead of isolation, but I'm also protecting myself from people who only want what I have. I'm using resources to create opportunities, but I'm also trying to enjoy the life I'm building. I'm not useless, but I'm also not defined by my wealth. I'm just Daniel, but a version of myself I'm finally proud to be." They'd stood in the cemetery for a while longer, but eventually they'd driven home to their shared life. A life built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that true wealth was measured in relationships, purpose, and growth rather than dollars. But the story didn't end there, because life doesn't wrap up neatly with perfect resolutions. Daniel continued to face challenges, complex business decisions, people who wanted access to his wealth, the ongoing work of processing his father's legacy, but he'd built a support system that helped him navigate it all. Emma had become his partner in every sense, but they'd agreed to keep their relationship private, avoiding the spotlight that came with Daniel's public profile. The foundation had expanded internationally, but Daniel had insisted on visiting each project personally, meeting the people his father's wealth was now helping. In those moments, standing in newly built schools or community centers, he'd felt his father's presence most strongly, not as the absent figure of his childhood, but as the architect of opportunities his secrecy had made possible. And sometimes, when Daniel sat in his home office late at night, reviewing reports and proposals, he'd take out his father's letter and read it one more time. The words never changed, but their meaning deepened with each reading. "Don't let it isolate you, but don't let others use you either. Trust slowly, but love completely." His father had struggled with that balance, but Daniel was determined to find it. The journey from being called useless to inheriting billions had been shocking, but the real transformation had been internal, learning to value himself independent of others' opinions, building something meaningful with his resources, but most importantly, remaining human despite circumstances that could easily have made him cynical or cold. What shocked Jessica and Richard wasn't just that Daniel had inherited vast wealth, but that he'd used it to become more generous, more purposeful, and more genuine than either of them had imagined possible. Their assumption that he was useless had been based on limited understanding, but his response had been to prove them wrong, not through cruelty, but through building a life they couldn't have imagined. That was the real shock, not that he'd gotten rich, but that he'd gotten better. And in the end, that was the inheritance that mattered most, not his father's billions, but the choice to become someone who used resources to create opportunity, who maintained humanity despite betrayal, but who understood that true success was measured not in dollars, but in the lives you touched and the person you became along the way. The money had been transformative, but Daniel Crawford, no longer useless, no longer defined by others' limitations, but finally completely himself, had been the real transformation. And that was a story worth telling.